Hi, I'm Helen Watson. I'm a lecturer in biomedical sciences here, and I'll be taking quite a few of your life sciences sessions in year one. Welcome to this video on biological chemistry. We're going to talk about biological molecules and how they're important in understanding biological processes. In year one of your course here, you're going to look a lot at the basic concepts of human biology, and understanding the molecules that make up our bodies is really important to that. So there's quite a few molecules that we'll talk about a lot during your course. Firstly, DNA. So DNA is where our genetic information is stored. DNA is what we call a nucleic acid. So these molecules are big molecules, and they have the ability to carry a code, which means they can pass on information to the next generation. They also have the ability to replicate, which means that DNA can be copied from generation to generation and every time a cell divides. Understanding the structure of DNA means that you can understand how genetic diseases are passed on, for example. Another biological molecule very important we're going to talk about is proteins. And proteins are basically the nanomachines or tiny machines that run all of the processes in our bodies. They make enzymes which catalyze reactions, which we'll talk about a bit later. They make up things like antibodies, which protect us from infection. They also make up some hormones and some signaling molecules, which helps our body respond to things going on in the environment. Proteins are built from specific sequences of amino acids. So amino acids are the component parts, and they're coded for by our genome in our DNA. Lipids are another important class of biological molecules, that are otherwise known as fats, and they make up our cell membranes. And lipids are vital in making sure that our cells can keep things in and keep things out, and make sure that basically that we're waterproof and we can hold in water inside us. We will also talk about lots of other molecules, especially surrounding nutrition, things like sugars and carbohydrates, which are really important in generating energy. Everything is built from atoms. So atoms are the smallest constituent part of molecules. Atoms are made up of a few different components. So there's the nucleus, which is in the middle, containing the protons and neutrons, and electrons, which are basically in orbit around the nucleus. The size of atoms is absolutely tiny, so atoms are really the smallest component part of matter. So if you blew up all the atoms in a grapefruit, so if every atom in a grapefruit was the size of a blueberry, the grapefruit would be the size of planet Earth. So that gives you some idea about how many atoms are in a grapefruit and also how tiny they are. So each element from the periodic table of elements, for example, oxygen, carbon, iron, hydrogen, has different kinds of atoms in it. So each element has one kind of atom, and they're all different from other elements. And atoms in elements are made up of different numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons. This is what gives elements their different chemical properties. So neutrons are in the centre of atoms in the nucleus, and they have no charge. Protons, also in the centre in the nucleus, are positively charged, and the electrons that orbit around the outside are negatively charged. In an atom, the number of neutrons, protons, and electrons are equal. And because the negative and the positive charge cancel each other out, that means atoms don't have a charge overall. But atoms can become charged if they lose or gain electrons. So if they lose electrons, they become positively charged, and if they gain electrons, they become negatively charged. And these charged atoms are known as ions. So now we're going to talk a bit about molecules. So molecules are made up of atoms and varying numbers of atoms. So you can get small molecules, things like water, so H2O, which is just 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, as well as bigger molecules like some of the biological molecules we spoke about, like DNA and proteins. If we think about an average protein in the human body, an average protein might be made up of, say, 500 amino acids, and that will contain about 10,000 atoms, so quite a big molecule. So how do the atoms form molecules? Well, electrons are held in shells around the nucleus of an atom. So these shells of electrons can either be full or empty, or partially full. If an electron shell is almost full or almost empty, the atom will want to complete the shell or empty the shell by combining with another atom. So things with full electron shells the group of elements called the noble gases, are very unreactive because they're very stable. They don't need to lose or gain any more electrons. But pretty much everything else will be able to bond to other things because it either needs to lose an electron or gain an electron. So atoms in molecules are held together with bonds. So if we think about the electron shells and we think about a molecule of water, for example, so the innermost electron shell, the one nearest the nucleus, has a maximum spaces for 2 electrons. The next ones out have a maximum of 8 electrons. So if we think about a water molecule, hydrogen only has 1 electron in total, so it only has 1 in its outer shell, and really to be complete it needs 2. Oxygen has 6 in its outer shell when really it needs 8. So what this means is oxygen with 6 can combine with 2 hydrogens, so that oxygen adds 2 more electrons and the hydrogen gets the 2 from the oxygen, or hydrogen fills up the other 2 from the oxygen. So this means that the shells are all complete, and by bonding, those atoms can complete their shells. So we have ionic and covalent bonds, and these are the strong chemical bonds that hold together atoms in molecules. Things like molecules like water, molecules like proteins and DNA. Ionic bonds form things like metal salts. These are things like sodium chloride, so table salt, whereas covalent bonds tend to form in organic molecules, so many of the biological molecules that we're going to talk about. So in addition to these strong ionic and covalent bonds, there are other types of atomic interactions that help biological molecules stay together, form the right shape, and interact with each other. So in proteins, hydrophobic interactions are very important. So hydrophobic, so hydro means water and phobic means hate. So hydrophobic is hating water. And in proteins, hydrophobic regions of the protein tend to cluster together. So any area of the protein that doesn't like facing out to the water will be buried in the core of the protein, and the hydrophilic or water-loving parts will face out. So these hydrophobic interactions help form the final 3D shape of the structure. Hydrogen bonds are another important interaction in biological molecules. So these are interactions between hydrogen atoms, which are slightly positive, and other atoms like nitrogen and oxygen, which are slightly negative. So hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen are all very common elements in biological molecules. So hydrogen bonding occurs in organic molecules like DNA, and also in inorganic molecules like water. So here's a DNA helix. You'll see that we have 2 strands running along together, so 2 sides of the helix. And the bases in the middle of the helix pair up specifically, and that's how DNA has a specific code. And between each one of those bases, hydrogen bonds basically hold them together. So hydrogen bonds allow the specific pairing between the bases in DNA.